Hello, thank you for joining me. I wanted to talk today about something that I've been thinking about and writing about a lot, which is the new leadership under President Xi Jinping and his attempts to centralize power. So previously what we saw was that China was a fairly decentralized system, and a lot of my research looks at how the local level, so the provincial level and below the provincial level, how those local officials actually have a lot of power to design their own policies, implement their own policies, and adjust them accordingly. And so that's a really interesting facet of Chinese politics that's actually similar to American politics. So you have a lot of power at the state level. And so this is what we're used to seeing in China, but since Xi Jinping has taken power, we've seen a centralization of power. So taking power away from the local level and centralizing it in the hands of the central government. Now, the way that we know that this is happening, the things that we've seen that support this idea that there's a centralization of power, a few of these changes are institutional changes. So this is where Xi Jinping has created new committees inside of the party to supervise things that are normally done by the state at different levels. So for example, things like economic planning for state-owned enterprises. This is normally done by the state government, so each province would do this. And what we've seen instead is that Xi Jinping has created these small leading groups inside of the party that oversee the work of the state. And so effectively what this does is it shifts decision-making power about the economy, about finance, about the armed forces, away from those branches of the government and directly under Xi Jinping's power. We also have seen that as far as the Politburo, which is the ruling body inside the Chinese Communist Party, that the membership of the Politburo has been shrinking. So it used to have 9 members and now it has 7 members. So overall what we're seeing is this concentration of power at the central level, and trying to bring every aspect of Chinese society, governance, and the military all under the direct control of Xi Jinping. So one way that we see that he's been doing this, in addition to these institutional changes that I've talked about, is through an anti-corruption campaign. And so since Xi Jinping has taken office, he's been running this anti-corruption campaign, a so-called strike hard campaign. And it's designed to remove people from power who are engaged in corruption. What we've seen with past presidents is that they tend to use these at the beginning of their tenure as a way to take out political rivals. But what we haven't seen before is the campaigns last this long. So Xi Jinping's campaign, he started when he first took power, but is still ongoing. And also the number of people who've been investigated. So we see that more than 200,000 top officials have been investigated during this campaign. So the scope and the length of this anti-corruption campaign distinguish it from others. And the question is why do we see this corruption campaign being used, and why do we see this centralization of power? And there are really 2 main arguments here. One is the idea that Xi Jinping views corruption as basically the beginning stages of the party dissolving. And so this is really based on how he views the history of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. So previously, other leaders like the president before Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, they would describe the collapse of the Soviet Communist Party as due to ossification. And what they mean by ossification is just that the party became increasingly bureaucratic, increasingly disconnected from what was happening in society and the reforms that it needed to make. And so that's why it collapsed. But Xi Jinping has a different idea. So when he talks about the collapse of the Soviet Communist Party, he really blames it actually on Gorbachev and what he thinks of as sort of weak leadership. So you can see this quote that was taken from a speech that he made where he said that the Communist Party in the Soviet Union collapsed because nobody was man enough to stand up and resist. So basically he blames this as a crisis of leadership, that you didn't have strong leadership of the party and that's why the party collapsed. And so when you think then about the re-centralization of power, you see that it's basically designed to save the party, so that Xi Jinping is exerting more control over all aspects of Chinese society, the state, the economy, the armed forces, as a way to save the party, to strengthen the party. And so one thing that he thinks is an existential threat to the Communist Party is corruption. And so the argument here is that he's using the anti-corruption campaign to reduce corruption in the party, or at least the perception of corruption in the party, and thus save the party. So he's trying to strengthen the party by doing all of these different things that we've talked about. The other argument, the counter argument, is basically that Xi Jinping is re-centralizing power and using this anti-corruption campaign as a way of creating more power for his own personal rule. Basically that he's, trying to become the next emperor of China. And so that he's using this anti-corruption campaign as a way to take out political rivals and create a culture of fear that allows him to tighten his grip on other party members. Now, exactly why he wants this power, this argument is divided. So some people who argue that he's trying to gather this power for his own personal rule say he's just doing this for himself, right? This is the idea of Xi Jinping as the next emperor of China. Other people, though, say that he has a very strong vision of the kinds of reform that he thinks China needs, especially economic reform, and that he's basically trying to clear out anyone powerful enough to block his reforms. And so this argument says that once he clears these people out, that he would then undertake this large economic reform agenda and be able to push it through without people blocking it. So we'll have to wait and see what's happening here, whether in the future he shows more interest in strengthening the party, more interest in strengthening just Xi Jinping, or if he uses this power to then push through a reform agenda and really try to change the economy in China. So we would need more evidence in order to determine which one of these arguments is accurate. But these are the explanations we have for why Xi Jinping is trying to centralize power. So if we think about this anti-corruption campaign in a little more detail, what's really interesting about this campaign that's different from the past is that, first of all, it's gone on for a long period of time, but also that the targets are different. So more senior officials are targeted. Usually in these campaigns, it's only junior level officials, but instead we see really senior level officials being targeted. We also see that rather than just focusing on officials who work for the party or work for the state, that increasingly the net is a lot broader here, and that we see that people who work for the state-owned enterprises, especially the big oil companies, as well as those who work in the military, like generals, are being targeted in this campaign. And we haven't seen that in the past. Again, Xi Jinping addressing corruption is not just a tool, it's also in response to what people in China say that they see as a problem. So if you look at the Pew Research Center chart from opinion polling that they do each year in China, you see that corrupt officials are a
either a very big problem or a moderately big problem, but together have the highest score. 84% of citizens in China view it either as the biggest problem or a really large problem. And you can see that this is even outranking problems of pollution or this gap between the rich and poor. And so this is seen as a really large problem in China. And with this chart, I just wanted to show you that since Xi Jinping has taken over in 2012, you can see that especially in 2013 and 2014, rather than the campaigns wrapping up, as we've seen in the past when these are used, instead we see that they're actually picking up momentum, that more and more officials are being investigated, which sends the signal that this isn't just a campaign to get rid of some political rivals, but actually has larger goals behind it. So one of the goals that might be behind this is that Xi Jinping might see that getting rid of corruption in the party, or at least the perception of corruption in the party, might be really important to the legitimacy of the party and for the party to continue to rule in China. And this is because in China, we see that corruption is very, very tightly linked to the party. So when you think about the number of wealthy people who are in politics, you see that power, political power, and wealth are very tightly tied in China. So for example, if you look at some of the statistics that I've put on the slide, if you look at the number of billionaires who are either in the National People's Congress or the Consultative Congress, this is the group of people who consult with the Communist Party, you can see that there are increasingly larger numbers of billionaires, and we can see that this is larger than in any other country. So what we're seeing then is that economic wealth and political power are very tightly linked. The problem is that increasingly in China, people are seeing that the playing field is not level. So basically, if you're part of the political elite in China through processes of nepotism and other types of corruption, we see that there isn't social mobility, meaning that the children of people with political power are the ones who are going to become wealthy. And so in Chinese, they talk about this as the rich second generation. And there are a few different types of this, but the superstar second generation is a new category. But really what we're seeing is the government official second generation, the Guan Erdai, and the Hong Erdai, or the children of the communist revolutionaries. So these are people then who have political power either in the state or in the party. And because of that political power, their children are becoming wealthy. And so it's this link between political power and economic wealth, which is so problematic for the Communist Party. So when we think then about what this looks like, I wanted to use the example of the former premier, Wen Jiabao. So Wen Jiabao was actually seen as being a pretty clean official in China, so he was seen as being not corrupt and really encouraging his family to also not be corrupt. There was this groundbreaking story though done by the New York Times, which actually got the New York Times kicked out of China, where they revealed all of the hidden wealth in Wen Jiabao's family. So Wen Jiabao himself is seen as being fairly clean, but his family members used access to his political power to enrich themselves. And so if you look over this chart and you see his wife, his wife's brother, his children, you can see that they have fairly large fortunes, and most of their fortunes are related to political power and having access to that political power. So for example, if you look at his son, who is almost directly below the picture of Wen Jiabao, you can see that he basically received all of his positions in state-owned enterprises because of his father's connections. So he received these really high-ranking positions at a very young age because his father was the premier. And so this is part of the problem with corruption in China, is that it's seen as destroying social mobility. So if you are a high-ranking party member or government official, your children and your family will use corruption to enrich themselves at the expense of Chinese citizens. So you can see how this basically destroys the legitimacy of the Communist Party. Right, so a people's party or a working party that basically is filled with very wealthy elite, all of these millionaires and billionaires who use their political power to enrich themselves. So one of the stories that I think really shows how angry people are about this is the idea that this second generation, that they basically feel that the rules don't apply to them. So they can be wealthy and successful, and it doesn't matter what they do. The normal laws don't apply. And so this is a story about Li Qimin, who was the son of the deputy director of the Public Security Bureau in Baoding, which is a large city right outside of Beijing. He was driving his girlfriend home, and he struck two college students with his car, killed one of them, put the other one in the hospital, and just continued to drive his girlfriend home. He then parked in front of her dormitory, took her inside, and when he came out, his car was surrounded by a mob of citizens who had seen him hit and kill this girl. And so when he was surrounded by this mob and the police who had arrived, instead of saying that he was sorry, or instead of saying of offering any sort of excuse, he started yelling, "My father is Li Gang." Basically, what he said is, you can't arrest me even though I just killed a college student because of who my father is. So as you can imagine, this created a lot of outrage as the video of this situation was put on the internet and became really popular. So when Xi Jinping took power, he started this strike hard campaign, or an anti-corruption campaign. And what he said is basically that corruption is the cancer of the party, and that corruption will destroy the party. And so he has then used this campaign to investigate so-called tigers. And this is just a term used to refer to high-ranking government officials. So these are senior officials versus the flies, the junior officials, who are normally the ones caught up in this campaign. So again, in this campaign, you see that he has not only taken down junior officials, but also much more senior officials. And a lot of them are being charged with exactly what we were just talking about with these examples, that basically they're either accepting bribes for promotions or government positions, or they're giving these out to their family through nepotism. And so here are some of the examples, and I wanted to use these to show you how senior the officials are who are being caught up in this campaign, but also how expansive it is. So we see a general here who also was a former Politburo member. So normally former Politburo officials, these are the most powerful people in China, and they would normally be off limits for any type of anti-corruption campaign. We also see that the Vice Minister of Public Security was caught up in this campaign. So again, this is usually a part of the government that isn't usually caught up in these campaigns, right? They're the ones that are participating in them. And then we also see these former executives from the state oil conglomerate, right? So this is the state-owned enterprise that deals with oil and natural gas. So again, the campaign is really wide-ranging, and it's taking down senior targets. So this is a great example. This is Zhou Yongkang, who he basically was in charge of security and law enforcement. So this, again, is somebody who usually wouldn't be investigated for corruption. But you can see that not only was he investigated and charged, but that they used all of his networks and located other people. So you can see that his networks in the state-owned enterprise oil companies, as well as his regional contacts in Sichuan, where he spent most of his political career, and then also in the security and law enforcement institutions in which he worked, that all of these people were investigated and many of them charged. So
why is this important? So when we think about this anti-corruption campaign and taking out all of these senior targets and Xi Jinping basically centralizing political power in his own hands, what are the implications of this? Is this a good thing for China? Is this going to clean up the party and strengthen the party? Is this a bad thing for China? So one thing that you could imagine is that as Xi Jinping uses this campaign to clean up the party, that this might actually be a really good thing for the party, right? So that this would get rid of people who are really corrupt, the party would have a better reputation in society, and it would be strengthened. The problem is that Xi Jinping isn't trying to change any of the root causes of corruption in China. So the fact that party members are basically above the rule of law, that there aren't any other branches that can supervise the party or the state. So basically they have absolute power. Well, absolute power tends to lead to these corrupt activities. And so what Xi Jinping is saying is he isn't trying to change any of those institutions to create more accountability. Instead, he's just using this campaign. So once he stops using this campaign, it's entirely likely, in fact, probable, that people will go right back to doing what they were doing before. So this basically is a temporary fix, but it won't really solve the problems of the party. Also, you could imagine that as this campaign goes into its third and fourth year, that a lot of people who are political elites are alienated by this campaign, and there's a danger in continuing to run this campaign. So if no one is safe in China, but Xi Jinping needs the support of other political elites in which to rule, it raises questions of, potential coup attempts or other ways of trying to remove Xi Jinping from power and ending this campaign. We also might see that if Xi Jinping is trying to gain this power in order to keep this power for himself, for the purposes of personal power, you might see that he changes the rules in China. So this isn't exactly a rule, but it's a norm that normally the president serves 2 5-year terms. So the president usually serves for 10 years in total, and then hands power peacefully over to a successor. Well, there are real questions right now about whether Xi Jinping would be willing to hand power over once he's managed to amass so much power and centralize it in just his hands. So is there a danger here that the political institutions that we've become accustomed to will actually be destroyed, and that we might see more of a dictatorship being established in China? Again, we don't know the answer to any of these questions. These are just some of the possible implications of this centralization of power and this use of an anti-corruption campaign. But what we would want to look for in the future in order to understand what's happening is, does Xi Jinping wrap up this anti-corruption campaign and start to try to create some sorts of checks and balances inside of the party and the state in order to try to change the root causes of corruption. So this could be creating, an anti-corruption commission, which would be independent and report only to the president, but would actually be part of the legal system. So he could strengthen the legal system. He could do lots of things short of creating other parties that would create checks and balances. So that would be something that we would want to look for. Are there other ways that he's trying to address the problem of corruption? We would also want to see that he seems to be following the rules, so that he is willing to transition power and isn't trying to establish a new dictatorship. So these are some of the concerns then that we have about this current centralization of power and anti-corruption campaign. And basically we don't know the answers to these. All we understand are some of the possible implications. And so this is something then that we'll need to watch closely in the future as far as what the purpose of this re-centralization of power is and what it means for Chinese governance.